Hi, my name is Fred Mayako. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Renton School District. There has been much conversation about our budget situation in the Renton School District. My intent today is to provide you with a high-level overview of our current situation and the process we will use this spring to develop the budget for 2020 to 21. In coming weeks, you will hear much more about the budget deficit we face and proposed changes to school budgets and staffing allocations. We hope to gather your ideas and feedback as we make necessary reductions, but make no mistake about it, we have to make reductions. So in this presentation, I'll quickly discuss the most important top-line messages and Superintendent Patnaud's guiding principles, which will help organize our work. We'll then dive a bit deeper into the budget deficit we face and the impact of declining revenues and declining enrollment on the immediate task at hand. I'll review quickly how enrollment drives everything we do, from staffing allocations to budgets for supplies and materials. Finally, we'll discuss local levies and limitations imposed by the legislature on our ability to raise resources. So the top-line messages are shown here. First, we face a budget deficit of between $12 and $15 million. This results primarily from a structural imbalance between expenditures and revenues, reduced levy collections, increasing labor costs, and declining enrollment. Importantly, our recently approved school bond authority may only be used to raise money for construction activities, not for general fund requirements for the operation of schools. For the current year only, the school board has authorized the use of district reserve funds to help offset the imbalance between revenues and expenditures. We must close the deficit as we move into the coming school year. As a result, we're going through a deliberate process to identify specific reductions to personnel and programs this spring in order to align expenditures with expected revenues. Today's overview is intended to help set the stage for those discussions. As Superintendent and Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Patnaud is the District Budget Officer. He outlined the following principles to guide our work in the budget development process. First, we must prioritize student-focused activities in alignment with our core values. Second, we will think about the long-term impacts of our decisions. And finally, we must ensure that our schools and our classrooms remain supportable from a logistics and operations perspective. So pictured here is a district-wide look at our general fund budget for the current school year. Revenues are primarily derived from state and local resources based upon the number of students measured in average annual full-time equivalents attending our schools. The chart shows expenditures in excess of revenues to the tune of $8.25 million. That's a problem, and only possible because the school board authorized us to fill the deficit with reserve funds for the current school year. Of course, we can't continue to tap into our reserve funds year after year, or they will soon be depleted. It's just like in your own household budget. If you have a period of higher than expected expenses, you might go to savings for a short-term fix, but long-term you have to bring income and expenses into alignment. Similarly, the Renton School District must bring revenues and expenditures into alignment. But how did we get here? Why are expenses higher than revenues? I'll endeavor to explain why this has happened in subsequent slides. This slide depicts a 6-year picture of revenues and expenditures. It reveals an interesting dynamic which helps to explain how we got to this point. Note 4 years of pretty tight alignment between revenues and expenditures from 2014-15 to 2017-18. Then in the 2018-19 school year, revenues expanded substantially. A significant infusion of money was added to the district's revenue picture that year, primarily resulting from the McCleary settlement between the Washington State Legislature and the Washington State Supreme Court. The legislature infused a large chunk of money into public education during that biennium, and substantial raises were passed out across the board. This was also a time of double-digit growth in property values and growing student enrollment. However, as part of the McCleary settlement, The legislature imposed specific limitations on local tax collections, which were to be imposed beginning in 2019. From the graph, we can see that revenue growth slowed in 2019, while expenditures continued to rise. The slowdown in revenue growth primarily results from the limitations to local revenues imposed by the legislature. Specifically, the legislature capped our ability to collect local revenues. The lower limits significantly reduced the ability of Renton School District to collect local resources authorized by voters. Seeing the cap on the horizon in 2018 to 19, the school board wisely put money away to prevent mid-year reductions and allow us some time to make the reductions necessary going forward without going through a mid-year crisis. But it is also clear from this graph that expenditures must be brought in alignment. They must be reduced and aligned with revenues. So on the prior slide, I mentioned local levies. There are several types of levies authorized by the legislature for voter consideration. Each type has very specific limitations and purposes. Renton School District has had great support from voters and currently has 3 local levies authorized. First, an Enhancement, Personnel, and Operations, or EPO levy. Second, a Capital/Technology levy. And third, a Capital Projects or Bond levy. The Capital Projects or Bond levy and the Capital Tech levy are specifically restricted as to their purposes. The Bond levy is primarily for school construction activities, while the Capital Tech levy is primarily for technology investments. Neither may be used to offset the deficit in the general fund. However, the Enhancement, Personnel, and Operations levy, or EPO levy, which was previously known as the Maintenance and Operations levy, is specifically designed to give us additional resourcing for general fund programs. It is this levy which provides the resourcing to help ensure lower class sizes and the support staff needed in our schools to supplement and fund programming beyond what the basic school resourcing that is provided by the state. So this chart shows the collection of local resources from our voters and depicts the excess personnel and operations levy shown as local dollars in comparison to state revenues shown here as common funds. Note the years of generally flat common funding through 2017. These are the resources collected from local property owners as the common school tax, which returned to Renton School District. During these years from 2010 to 14, local resources grew, helping us to defray the increasing costs which were not funded by the state and its prototypical school model. Then in 2018, we saw a huge increase in common school funding. This was the McCleary settlement. Unfortunately, that settlement also imposed a new limitation on local levies, limiting collections to the lesser of $1.50 per thousand of assessed valuation, or $2,500 per student beginning in 2019. For Renton School District, this newly imposed limit was disastrous. In 2018, Renton voters authorized us to collect $53 million in local taxes beginning in 2019 to help improve educational programs and services. The new state limit capped our collections at just over $39 million. In short, the application of the new limit to this year's budget means a $15 million shortfall over what our voters authorized. And remember, these are the resources that we use to pay for supplemental services beyond what the state funds in the prototypical school model. Had this new levy cap not been imposed, we would not be having this discussion about impending program and budget reductions. All right, so let's review where we are. The state has a paramount duty to educate our students and make ample provision for these efforts. But despite the best efforts of the legislature, state funding is simply inadequate to do all that we ask or require. As a result, school districts go to local voters to ask for supplemental support in the form of local levies and construction bonds. And as it relates to the general fund in Renton specifically, the EPO levy accounts for approximately 18% of general fund resources. In 2018, our voters authorized additional funds, but later that same year, the legislature capped our levy collections at rates lower than we anticipated, resulting this year in a $15 million shortfall. So where do we go from here in building next year's budget? As we set our sights on next year, that means starting with the fundamental driver of both revenues and costs, and that is student enrollment. Unfortunately, student enrollment has dropped unexpectedly this year. Already this year, we are at approximately 300 students less than what was budgeted. In fact, we estimate that this number will grow slightly to 360 or 370 students less year over year than what we budgeted. And we expect to see continued enrollment losses for the next 2 to 3 years until finally stabilizing. So as we move into budget development for next year, we must right-size our staffing, programs, and support operations to account for the enrollment decline and for the loss in local revenues. As you know, fewer students mean fewer staff and fewer programs. Taken all together, the loss in local revenues, rising costs in the greater Seattle Metroplex, and reduced authority to collect local revenues adds up to a projected budget deficit of between $12 and $15 million. Therefore, we need to cut between $12 and $15 million from the budget for next year. So what can you expect? We're already embarking upon a significant planning effort to better understand our expenditures and make necessary adjustments. For context, the reductions we seek represent approximately 5% of general fund expenditures in total. The sky is not falling, but instead of making sweeping, broad, general cuts across the board, we're going through a very deliberate process whereby every program and every department must justify staffing and expenditure levels. During the month of February, we are specifically reaching out to school and department staff across the district. We are also reaching out to the community more broadly with various forms of communication. We want your input and suggestions about how we can reduce staffing and operations in a prudent manner, keeping in mind the guiding principles that Dr. Patnaud provided us. And we need your help to do so as effectively as possible. Please note the various opportunities listed here for you to participate in this process. I'm Dr. Fred Mayako, the Chief Financial Officer for the Renton School District. Thank you for reviewing this PowerPoint presentation and for participating in this process.